Destroy Ivanka Trump. The words slid into Mark Jennings's earpiece like a shard of ice, a final, chilling directive from the control room. It wasn't about her father anymore. The network's analytics had shown his supporters were immovable, his critics already convinced. It wasn't about Melania's enigmatic silence or Barron's awkward youth. It was about her, Ivanka, the polished, perfect, aspirational bridge between the family's raw populism and the world of corporate respectability. She was the dynasty's most carefully constructed asset, and therefore, its most vulnerable point. To destroy her wasn't just to win the ratings war, it was to shatter the entire myth. On stage, under the searing white light of a dozen studio lamps, she sat unaware, a figure of flawless presentation. The set around her was a marvel of modern broadcast design, sleek, cold, and imposing. Panels of polished glass and brushed steel reflected the glare, giving the space the air of a high-tech courtroom rather than a talk show. The color scheme, a stark combination of patriotic red, corporate blue, and judicial black, was no accident. This was an altar of public judgment, and the family had willingly placed themselves upon it. They were arranged like figures in a royal portrait, a tableau of power and contained tension. Donald Trump, her father, leaned back, affecting an air of casual command. His arms were crossed, a trademark blend of bravado and deep-seated suspicion in his eyes as he scanned the audience, offering a tight, proprietary smile to the sections that applauded him. Beside him, Melania Trump was a study in serene immobility. Her posture was perfect, her expression as smooth and unreadable as polished marble. She was a veteran of these storms, a statue of elegance who had learned that the best defense was to offer nothing, to conserve her energy, while others burned themselves out in the heat of the fight. Then there was Barron, his youth a stark, uncomfortable contrast to the calculated poise of the others. Now 19 and towering, he seemed to be trying to shrink into his chair, his eyes fixed on the tabletop, desperate to avoid the ravenous gaze of the cameras and the 1,000 pairs of eyes dissecting his every fidget. But the focus, the true, predatory focus of the evening, was on Ivanka. She sat with a ramrod-straight spine, a defense mechanism against the dread coiling in her stomach. Her smile was camera-ready, a perfect crescent of white teeth, but her fingers gripped the arm of her chair with a pressure that turned her knuckles white. The phrase from the show's promos, "Family Truths," had been echoing in her mind for days, a low, ominous drumbeat. She knew what such phrasing invited. She knew how quickly whispers became narratives, how narratives hardened into belief. She had spent her entire adult life managing those narratives, polishing the family name until it gleamed. Now, she felt like a curator watching as a pyre was being built around her most prized possession. The air wasn't just thick with anticipation, it was combustible, and she felt sickeningly certain that she was the one they had chosen as the kindling. Mark Jennings turned to the family, his professional smile a well-oiled mechanism honed by 3 decades of live television. This was the most treacherous part of the plan, the feigned calm, the lulling rhythm of normalcy before the ambush. The initial segment was a carefully choreographed dance of pleasantries, a platter of softball questions designed to make the subjects relax, lower their guards, and step more willingly into the cage. His hands felt slick under the hot lights as he angled his body toward the patriarch. "Mr. President, thank you again for being here. It's been quite a year. How is life post-White House, and what does the future hold for the Trump brand?" Donald leaned into the microphone, the familiar swagger flowing back into him as if summoned by the camera's gaze. He was on his home turf now. "Well, Mark, it's been fantastic. Tremendous. Better than ever in many ways," he began, drawing from his arsenal of familiar phrases. "The people of this country, the real people, they know what we did. We built the greatest economy in the history of the world, and they want it back. They're tired of the weakness, the incompetence you see now. They call me every day. Governors, senators, hardworking patriots, every single day. We're going to do something, Mark, something very special." He gestured vaguely, a sweep of the hand that encompassed the studio, the nation, the world. A pocket of the audience, carefully seated with supporters, applauded with practiced enthusiasm. The cadence of his speech was pure muscle memory, a collection of greatest hits played to a rhythm that required no thought, only performance. Mark nodded, a perfect pantomime of journalistic interest before turning his attention to Ivanka. His producer's voice was a serpent in his ear. "Keep her comfortable, Mark. Let her feel safe. We need her relaxed for the fall." "Ivanka, you've stepped back from the political spotlight to focus on your family. Has that been a difficult transition after such an intense 4 years?" Ivanka's smile was flawless, a brilliant white shield she had perfected over a lifetime. Her answer was polished, serene, and utterly devoid of the terror screaming in her veins. "My priority has always been my children," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "It's a privilege to be able to focus on them, to build a life grounded in what truly matters. Public service was the honor of a lifetime, but family is, and will always be, everything." It was the perfect answer, armor forged in 1,000 interviews, but her eyes betrayed her. They flickered again, a brief, nervous tick, scanning the sea of faces in the audience. She was hunting for a threat she couldn't see, a predator she could feel in the tall grass. The producers in the control room saw it on the 4K monitors. "She knows," one of them muttered. "She can smell it. All right, that's enough. Let's get to it. Mark, start the pivot. Tease the segment. Cue camera 4 on Jasmine. Let's get a shot of the predator before she strikes." Mark heard the instruction. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from genial to grave. The studio lights seemed to narrow, the air growing colder. "Tonight," he began, his voice dropping an octave, "we promised our viewers something more, something real. We promised questions that won't be filtered, voices that won't be silenced. This isn't just about politics. It's about people, about families, about truth." The theatrical weight of his words hung in the air. A floor manager gave a subtle, almost invisible hand signal to the third row. On stage, Ivanka's jaw tightened. She recognized the tone, the sound of a door being unlocked, a trap being sprung. The carefully constructed performance was over. The interrogation was about to begin. As the last echo of Mark's solemn monologue faded, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat in the third row. The movement was not sudden or aggressive. It was fluid and deliberate, imbued with a gravity that commanded the immediate attention of the entire room. It was the posture of someone who knew they belonged in the spotlight, even if they had to seize it for themselves. The first sound to break the hush was the audible whir of a robotic camera motor as it swung toward her, its lens a cold, black eye finding its new mark. A ripple of whispers moved through the audience like a current, heads turning in a wave of collective curiosity. On stage, the family's reactions were a series of rapid, telling snapshots in the glare of the lights. Donald's smile faltered, a momentary glitch in his programming, before it rebooted, harder now, edged with the cold steel of a man preparing for a fight. Melania's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, her gaze not shocked but analytical, a silent, swift calculation of this new variable, this unexpected piece on the board. Ivanka's lips parted as though to protest, a silent objection to a breach in protocol, her entire body tensing as if bracing for an impact she'd long feared. And Baron, poor Baron, simply leaned forward, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Mark Jennings, a master of feigned surprise, played his part to perfection. "Ah," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "It seems we have a question from one of our audience participants. Please, go ahead." A floor manager, seemingly anticipating this spontaneous moment, was already there with a microphone. Jasmine took it, her hand steady, her grip firm. She didn't look at the host or the cameras. Her eyes were locked directly on the family, bypassing the patriarch, bypassing the polished daughter, and settling with unnerving focus on the youngest member at the table. Control room was electric. "That's it," the producer hissed into Mark's earpiece. "Hold on her, get a tight shot of Baron's reaction, and Ivanka. I want to see Ivanka's face when the words land. Push in, camera 2, push in, now." The silence in the studio stretched, becoming a presence of its own, a taut, vibrating wire pulled to its breaking point. Every viewer, both in the room and at home, felt it. This was not an impromptu question. This was a detonation, and they were all about to feel the shockwave. Jasmine's voice cut through the stillness. It was not loud or harsh. but it carried the precise, unwavering clarity of someone who knows she will not be interrupted. This question is for Baron. The direct address was the first blow. It was a calculated violation of the unspoken rule. You go through the father. Donald's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Jasmine's eyes never left the young man. Baron, she repeated, her tone steady, almost gentle, which only made the words that followed more brutal. For years, there have been persistent questions and whispers in the public sphere about your lineage. My question is not about the rumors themselves, but about you. Do you know why those questions exist? And are you prepared to address them, here and now, without your family answering for you? The words landed with the stunning concussive force of a physical blow. A collective, audible gasp swept the room. The host's breath hitched, a tiny, sharp sound betrayed by his lapel mic. On stage, the only perceptible movement was Ivanka's hand. Her fingers tightened on the arm of her chair until her knuckles turned a bloodless white. It was all the signal anyone needed to understand that a sacred, unspoken line had just been obliterated. For a long, agonizing beat, Baron didn't move. He stared, his mouth slightly agape, the look of a person who has just been struck by a bullet from an unseen sniper. The spotlight, once a warm glow of entertainment, had become an interrogation lamp, and it was aimed directly, mercilessly, at him. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine's question was not chaos, but a thick, suffocating silence. On stage, a maelstrom of frantic, unspoken calculation took hold. For Baron, the words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering under the hot lights like a heat haze. They were a foreign language he was being commanded to understand. The world shrank to the size of Jasmine Crockett's unblinking eyes, the low hum of the studio equipment buzzing in his ears like 1,000 angry wasps. He felt the weight of millions of viewers pressing down on him, a physical force that made it hard to breathe. He opened his mouth, a reflexive, fish-like gasp for air, but no sound came out. Mark Jennings, his professional veneer beginning to crack under the strain, tried to wrestle the segment back from the abyss. His geniality was a transparently thin shield against the raw hostility that now filled the room. "Thank you for your passionate question," he said, the hesitation betraying his panic. "But I must remind our audience that we aim to keep the discussion respectful and appropriate for all members of the family here tonight." In the control room, the sentiment was a snarled command. "No, no, no!" The producer's voice sliced into Mark's earpiece. "Don't you dare let them off the hook, Mark. Don't you give them an out. Stay with it. This is the show." Before the host could stammer another word, Donald Trump launched his counteroffensive. It was a well-rehearsed, brutally effective maneuver he had perfected over decades. He didn't look at his son, whose pain was a tactical liability. He looked directly into the barrel of camera one, his face a mask of righteous fury, speaking not to the room, but to his loyal legions at home. "This is a disgrace," he began, his voice a low growl that built into a roar. "An absolute disgrace. But it's not a surprise. This is what the radical left does. It's all they have left. When they can't win on policy, when they've run out of arguments because our country was stronger and richer and safer with me, they attack family. They come after children. It's sick, and the American people see right through this disgusting, pathetic theater." A smattering of applause mixed with uneasy murmurs from the audience. It was classic Trump. Reframe the attack, identify the enemy, and galvanize the base. Ivanka, the family's designated firewall, leaned toward her microphone. Her voice was a shield of polished steel, soft but unbreakable. "He is a private citizen," she stated, her words sharp and precise. "He is not a politician. He is a young man who did not choose this life. He is not here to be subjected to baseless, malicious, and frankly insane rumors circulated on the internet by people with sick agendas. He should not, and will not, be forced to answer that." Her defense was immediate and fierce, a blend of a sister's protection and a PR strategist's damage control. The line between the two had long since vanished. But Jasmine, still standing, did not flinch. She absorbed their attacks without a flicker of emotion, her calm a weapon against their frenzy. "Respectfully," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise, "this family has leveraged its image for decades, Every family photo has been a political asset. The public has been asked to accept these curated narratives, to vote for a brand built on the idea of family. Tonight, we were promised truth. Is Barron's truth the one exception? Is he not allowed to have his own voice? She kept her eyes locked on Barron, a silent, powerful challenge that bypassed his father's bluster and his sister's defense. It was a masterful move, reframing her question not as an attack, but as an offer of agency. The direct appeal seemed to reach him. Barron finally found his voice. It was low, where than expected, halting, and carried the profound weariness of a young man forced into an arena he never chose. I don't know what you think you know," he murmured, his eyes downcast. "People say things." The simple, pained words were more powerful than any denial. Donald recognized the danger immediately. He placed a hand flat on the table, a gesture of absolute finality. "We're not doing this," he declared, his voice cold and hard as iron. "We do not dignify lies with a response. Next question mark." But there was no next question. The cage had been rattled, and now everyone in the room, and everyone watching at home, could see the animal trapped inside. Mark Jennings, seeing the interview spiraling into a gladiatorial contest, made a desperate, high-minded attempt to regain control. He tried to elevate the moment, to frame the raw, personal confrontation as a broader, more dignified conversation about the ethics of modern media. It was a classic broadcast maneuver. When the fire gets too hot, smother it with the wet blanket of intellectualism. "Perhaps," he began, his voice taking on a professorial tone, "this raises a larger, more important point about the nature of public life in the 21st century, about the erosion of privacy and the often cruel, insatiable appetite of an audience that has forgotten the human cost of its curiosity." He gestured thoughtfully, transforming himself from a host into a cultural commentator, hoping to guide the family onto safer, more philosophical ground. "We've seen this before, haven't we?" he continued, his gaze sweeping across the tense faces on the stage. "There was a time, after a young Chelsea Clinton was mercilessly mocked in the 90s, when a bipartisan consensus seemed to emerge. A brief, shining moment of decency, where we all agreed that the children of political figures were off limits. But social media, the algorithms of outrage, seem to have rewired our collective empathy into a kind of blood sport. We've turned citizenship into a spectator sport, inviting everyone to become a juror, a judge, and sometimes an executioner in the court of public opinion." It was a worthy, eloquent speech, and for a fleeting moment, it almost worked. He was offering the family an exit ramp, a way to reclaim the moral high ground by discussing a principle instead of a painful personal wound. Donald nodded sagely, his expression one of profound agreement as he seized the lifeline. "He's exactly right. Exactly. There is no decency left," he declared, his voice resonating with sorrowful gravitas. "They have no boundaries, no shame. It's all about ratings and clicks and destroying people. It's a very, very sad thing to watch." But Jasmine Crockett was not a guest to be managed. She waited patiently, letting Mark's dignified circle complete itself. When he was finished, she stepped back into the silence, her voice cutting through the philosophical fog with the sharp, cold edge of historical fact. "History also remembers something else," she said, her tone quiet but insistent. "It remembers when truth was managed, manipulated, and suppressed by the powerful. It remembers the whispers about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, dismissed as vile slander for nearly 2 centuries until DNA evidence forced a new, uncomfortable national understanding. It remembers the powerful politicians who built fortresses of denial around their private lives until secret payments and love children and sworn testimony turned rumors into indictments." The audience murmured, a low, uneasy sound. She wasn't just asking a question anymore. She was placing this family on a historical continuum of power and secrecy. "I'm not here to smear," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "I am here to ask whether silence has become this family's official policy. Because when every attempt to clarify a simple human question is met with accusations, deflection, redirection, or monetization, the public has a right to wonder what exactly is being protected: the truth or the brand." Those words stung more than the original question. They struck at the very heart of their public identity, questioning the foundation upon which their entire empire was built. The audience's reaction was no longer simple or unified. It was a jagged, conflicted sound, the noise of people wrestling with their own conscience in real time. Ivanka's voice, when it came, was a raw whisper that ached to be a command. "Please," she begged, her eyes darting between Jasmine and the host. "He is not the one you want." It was a slip, a fatal, revealing admission that there was, in fact, a target, a battle being waged. Jasmine, sensing the crack in the armor, turned her focus back to the young man at the center of the storm. Her tone was almost gentle now, the final, devastating turn of the screw. "Baron," she said softly, "do you want to answer for yourself?" The question hung there, its double meaning palpable. Answer the question. Be accountable for yourself. Free yourself. The spectacle ceased to be about politics. It became a profound and terrible question about adulthood, agency, and the impossible price of inheriting a story you did not write. Baron opened his mouth. The entire building seemed to lean in, every microphone straining, every camera lens focusing, hungry for the slightest tremor of his lips. The silence that followed his inhale stretched for so long that it became a physical presence, a fifth participant on the stage. It was a suffocating void, filled with the weight of unspoken history and the brutal pressure of a million expectations. Inside his head, a silent, screaming war was being waged. To speak would be to betray his family. To step on a landmine they had spent years carefully avoiding. To remain silent would be to betray himself, to let their narrative swallow him whole, confirming his status as a prop rather than a person. The lights felt hot enough to melt his skin. The low hum of the studio felt like a physical vibration in his bones. Ivanka watched him, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She could see the agony in the taut line of his jaw, in the way his hands twisted in his lap. He was just a boy, her boy, the brother she had shielded from the harsher realities of their gilded cage, and now he was on a public precipice, and she couldn't bear to watch him fall. Her protective instinct, a force more powerful than any PR strategy, erupted. "There are limits," she said, her voice strained but cutting through the silence. She leaned forward, a lioness defending her cub. "There are boundaries of basic human decency. And tonight, with this line of questioning, they have been egregiously crossed. This isn't a conversation. It's a public crucifixion staged for ratings." Her eyes flashed toward Jasmine, not with simple hostility, but with a kind of wounded, furious disbelief. "How could you do this?" her expression screamed. "How could you use him?" But her plea for decency was a miscalculation. In this arena, it sounded like a frantic attempt to hide the truth. The audience, now fully invested in the drama, wasn't looking for an off-ramp. They wanted a collision. A woman in the second row, her face contorted with righteous fervor, shouted into the void, "Answer the question!" The words sliced through the air. Another voice echoed it from across the room. Then another. Soon a chant began, ragged and uneven at first, but gathering a grim, pounding rhythm that seemed to sync with Ivanka's own terrified heartbeat. "Answer! Answer! Answer!" The sound was a physical assault. It rattled the stage, vibrated through the floor, and seemed to press in on them from all sides. It was no longer a polite studio audience. It had become a mob, a single organism roaring with a singular, insatiable demand. Baron's face drained of all color. Melania's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, her knuckles turning a bloodless white. Donald clenched his jaw, his predator's gaze scanning the crowd, assessing a threat that, for once, he couldn't shout down. The chant grew louder, more insistent, a relentless hammer beating against the fragile walls of their composure. Ivanka shook her head, a silent, desperate denial of the reality unfolding around her. "This isn't fair," she whispered, a plea swallowed by the roar. And then, under the relentless, crushing pressure of the noise, the sight of her brother's terror, and the weight of a lifetime of performance, something inside Ivanka snapped. A single choked sob tore from her throat. It was a small sound, an involuntary animal noise of pain, but in the electrified atmosphere, it was as loud and shocking as a gunshot. The chanting faltered, the rhythm breaking as heads turned. The mob, stunned by this sudden, raw display of human fragility, fell silent. Every camera swung to her, zooming in with predatory speed. Her carefully constructed composure shattered into a million pieces. Her hand flew to her mouth, but it was too late. Another sob followed, louder this time, a gut-wrenching sound that shook her entire frame. Tears welled in her eyes, carving clean, dark tracks through her perfect makeup. The nation watched, transfixed. The poised, unflappable, untouchable Ivanka Trump was unraveling in high definition. In the control room, a producer leaned forward, his eyes glued to the monitor showing a tight shot of her tear-streaked face. He whispered into his headset, his voice laced with adrenaline and a chilling, reverent awe. "We've got gold. Absolute gold." The silence that followed Ivanka's sob was profound and devastating. It was the silence of a collective shock, a moment when the bloodlust of the crowd gave way to a stunned, morbid curiosity. The spectacle had shifted from a political interrogation to something far more intimate and raw, the public disintegration of a human being. Ivanka's tears weren't just tears. They were the visible shattering of a myth, the cracking of a porcelain doll that had been presented as unbreakable for decades. The cameras lingered on her, feasting on the ruins of her composure. Jasmine, sensing the moment of maximum vulnerability, did not relent. She did not offer a comforting pause. Instead, she stepped into the void, her voice not cruel, but surgically, mercilessly precise. "Tears do not answer questions," she said, the words landing like stones in the quiet room. "America deserves clarity, not theatrics. We have seen this before, haven't we? When those in power are finally cornered by the truth, they often turn to emotion, hoping our sympathy will override our demand for accountability." Her words, though spoken softly, were a slap in the face. She was reframing Ivanka's breakdown not as a moment of authentic pain, but as a calculated political tactic. The audience murmured in recognition, the spell of sympathy broken. The host, desperate to salvage some semblance of dignity for the proceedings, tried to intervene. "We must remember," he pleaded, his voice thin and reedy, "that this is a family, not just a headline. There is a human cost here." But his plea for decency was instantly obliterated by a renewed shout from the crowd, a voice raw with impatience. "Then show us the proof!" The cry was primal, a demand for tangible evidence to cut through the emotional fog. It was picked up by others, a spark catching in dry grass, and it quickly merged into a new, more potent chant. "AUD, ends, proof, proof, proof." The studio shook with it. The demand was primal, insatiable, and Jasmine, with the timing of a master strategist, struck. She reached down beside her chair and lifted a slim black folder into the air. The cameras, as if programmed for this exact moment, instinctively zoomed in on it. It was plain, unadorned, just a simple piece of office stationery. But under the intense studio lights, in this charged atmosphere, it felt like the most powerful object in the room. It was a vessel of secrets, a tangible threat. "You want proof?" Jasmine asked, her voice rising, cutting cleanly through the chant. "I have in my possession documents, testimony, pieces that point to the uncomfortable truths this family has spent years and millions of dollars burying." She didn't open it. She held it up, a sheathed blade, its potential more terrifying than any specific reality it might contain. The audience erupted. It was pure, unadulterated chaos. Donald slammed his palm on the table, the sound cracking like a gunshot through the microphones. "Fake!" he thundered, his face a mask of crimson fury. "A total fabrication. This is what they do. They create lies. They wave around fake papers. They destroy good, hard-working people for ratings. It's a disgrace. Shame on this network. Shame." His defense was a storm of familiar accusations, but for the first time it felt defensive, almost frantic. Meanwhile, Ivanka's quiet sobs turned into unrestrained, gasping cries. "Please, stop this!" she choked out, her words dissolving into ragged breaths. "I can't!" Baron awkwardly touched her arm, his own hand trembling so violently it was visible on camera. Melania remained perfectly still, a marble statue in the midst of an earthquake. Her eyes, however, were not on Jasmine. They were fixed on her husband, her expression a cold, unreadable mask of calculation. In the control room, the chaos was a symphony. "Get the legal team on standby now!" one producer barked. "Are you kidding me?" Another shot back, his eyes gleaming. "This is Emmy-winning history-making television. Stay on the folder. Get a close-up of her hands. I want to see every damn paper cut." Jasmine, with perfect control, lowered the folder back to her lap, her restraint amplifying the tension tenfold. "You see?" she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial calm that forced the audience to lean in. "Even the mention of evidence is enough to shake this dynasty to its very core. What does that tell you?" Her question hung in the air, an indictment not of Barron, but of their collective, palpable fear. The optics were devastating. Ivanka undone, Donald raging, Barron paralyzed, and Melania a silent, chilling enigma. The folder remained closed, yet it had already done its work. It had turned suspicion into a tangible object, a black box of secrets that the family, in their terror, dared not open. As the chant of "proof, proof, proof" reached a fever pitch, a tremor of a different kind ran through the studio. Mark Jennings, who had been a helpless bystander to the carnage, received a shocking last-minute instruction in his earpiece. His eyes widened, his face paling. He looked from the producer's booth, where two executives were gesticulating wildly, to the stage, then back again. This was not in the script. This was a nuclear option. He swallowed hard, the sound audible on his mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice stammering, betraying the sheer shock of the moment. We have just been informed that there is someone here tonight who has asked to speak, someone who says they were part of this family's world, a former senior aide from the White House." The announcement acted like a stun grenade, detonating in the superheated atmosphere. The chanting ceased instantly, replaced by a wave of sharp, collective gasps and frantic, disbelieving whispers. On stage, Donald's face, which had been red with fury, turned a pale, mottled white. The rage was momentarily replaced by something that looked terrifyingly like genuine fear. From the shadows of the backstage area, a figure emerged, walking into the light. It was a former White House staffer, 40s, dressed in a nondescript but professional suit, their face a mask of calm, resolute purpose. As they walked, their name and title flashed on the chyron at the bottom of the screen in stark white letters. Jessica Pierce, Senior Policy Advisor, 2017-2019. The name meant nothing to most, but the title was a dagger. This wasn't a low-level disgruntled employee. This was someone from the inner sanctum. Donald shot out of his chair, his body quivering with a rage that was now clearly laced with panic. "No, absolutely not. This is a setup," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the approaching figure. "This is a joke. This person is a nobody, a disgruntled employee we fired for incompetence, a failure who couldn't handle the job. They fetched coffee. That's all they did, liar." Security moved to the edge of the stage, forming a subtle but clear barrier. But they made no move to intercept Jessica Pierce, who walked with deliberate, unhurried steps to a spare microphone that had been discreetly placed there during a commercial break. She adjusted the mic, completely ignoring Donald's tirade as if it were the buzzing of a fly. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, clear, amplified, and carried the chilling weight of first-hand experience. "I did not fetch coffee," she began, her calm a stark contrast to the frenzy around her. "I worked in the West Wing. I was in the policy meetings. I was on the email chains. I saw how documents were handled, how inquiries were managed, and I saw how questions, uncomfortable questions from within the administration itself, were raised behind closed doors and then systematically buried under layers of classification and executive privilege before they could ever reach the public." The audience was utterly silent, hanging on every word. "I saw the lengths people went to," she continued, her eyes sweeping over the family on the stage, "to protect not the office of the president, not the integrity of the government, but the Trump family brand." Mark leaned forward, his journalistic instincts finally overriding his producer's script. "Are you saying there are official records? Records pertaining to this specific matter of lineage?" Jessica held up a hand, her expression unchanging. I am saying that the questions Ms. Crockett has raised tonight were not just whispers on the internet. They were documented concerns. They were logged in memos. They were discussed by senior staff and legal counsel in the Oval Office. And then the SHATTERS were ordered to be sealed. I don't claim to know the ultimate truth, but I know this with absolute certainty. The truth exists on paper. The studio erupted. Donald stormed toward the staffer, but security stepped firmly in his path. Lies! It's all lies! You know nothing! Jasmine, still holding her folder, turned to the witness, her voice ringing with clarity. And would you be willing to testify to that, under oath, before Congress? Jessica Pierce looked directly into the main camera, her gaze unwavering, speaking not just to the studio, but to the entire country, and to the Department of Justice. Yes, she said simply. I would. The eruption that followed was volcanic. The audience was on its feet, a chaotic sea of cheers, boos, and shouts of disbelief. On stage, Ivanka collapsed back into her chair, a hand flying to her heart as she whispered, "Oh my God, it's over." The fortress of denial had been breached, not by a rumor, but by the quiet, bureaucratic certainty that a paper trail exists, waiting to be found. The staffer's testimony, calm, factual, and delivered with the chilling finality of an oath, hung in the air like a death sentence. The chaos in the studio was absolute, a raw, primal roar of a nation divided, witnessing what felt like the live demolition of a monument. But amidst the noise, the true breaking point, the moment the foundations finally gave way, came not from a witness or a folder, but from deep within the heart of the family itself. Ivanka, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of horror, had been staring at Jessica Pierce as if seeing a ghost. The confirmation of a paper trail, of memos and meetings, was not a revelation to her. It was the horrifying materialization of a nightmare she had lived with for years. The weight of it all, the years of smiling deflection, the carefully worded denials, the constant, gnawing fear of exposure, became physically unbearable. She pushed herself upright, her movements clumsy, desperate. She turned not to the audience, not to Jasmine, but to the source of it all, her father. The cameras, sensing the shift, zoomed in with predatory speed, capturing the raw, volcanic emotion churning in her eyes. Her voice, hoarse from crying and shredded by stress, cut through the din with the shocking power of a breaking dam. Enough! The single word, torn from the depths of her being, silenced the room. The chanting stopped. The shouting died. Everyone, the audience, the host, Melania, and most of all, Donald, froze. Enough, Father, she repeated, her voice cracking but resolute. Donald stared at her, his mouth agape. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. This was an unthinkable betrayal. This was not defiance from an enemy. It was a full-blown rebellion from his most loyal soldier, his most polished creation. All my life, she began, the words tumbling out, a torrent of buried pain and long, held resentment breaking free. All my life, I have stood up here, protecting you, protecting us. I smiled when I was screaming inside. I deflected questions I knew had no good answers. I have carried the weight of secrets that were never mine to keep, and I can't do it anymore. I won't. She was not just crying now. She was confessing. Confessing her role, her complicity, her complete and utter exhaustion. Donald lunged forward in his seat, his voice a low, menacing growl. Don't you dare. Don't you dare turn on me, Ivanka. After everything I've given you, everything I've done for you. But his threats, which had once held the power to bend wills and shape realities, were meaningless now. They bounced off the armor of her pain. She didn't cower. She didn't look away. For the first time in her life, she looked him straight in the eye, her tears giving her a strange, fierce strength. I won't be your shield anymore, she cried, the declaration detonating in the silent room. The audience gasped, then erupted. The sound was a mix of wild, cathartic cheers and furious, venomous boos. The slogans of the Civil War being waged in the room shifted instantly. Tell it all! Clashed with a new, venomous chant of, Traitor! Baron clutched her arm, whispering her name urgently, his young face a mask of terror, but she shook her head, her focus unbroken. She turned her gaze to her brother, her voice softening with a wave of protective sorrow. "No, Baron," she said, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have to carry this. None of it. You never should have." Melania, who had been a statue of ice all night, finally moved. She leaned back in her chair and deliberately, slowly, folded her arms across her chest. It was not a gesture of comfort or support. It was a gesture of complete and final withdrawal, of cold, calculated judgment, a silent, chilling statement to the world and to her husband that Ivanka was now on her own. Donald, seeing his daughter's defiance and his wife's glacial detachment, finally spiraled out of control. "You're weak!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You let them get to you. This is what they want. They're destroying our family, and you're helping them." Jasmine's calm voice slid into the wreckage like a surgeon's scalpel. "This is what happens when truth is buried too long," she observed. "It doesn't vanish. It erupts." Ivanka's tears kept falling, but her voice was steady as she delivered the final, devastating blow, a public act of abdication. "I am done protecting lies," she said, and then she pointed a trembling, accusing finger at her father. "If you want the truth, ask him, because I will not answer for him anymore." The audience erupted. A new chant began, swelling, consuming the studio, a single word aimed like a battering ram at the patriarch, now abandoned, exposed, and utterly alone. "Audience, answer! Answer! Answer!" Donald Trump stood frozen, his mouth open, his voice gone. He was cornered, not by his enemies, but by his own daughter. The shield was shattered. The chant of "Answer! Answer! Answer!" became a physical force, a relentless, pounding wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. It was the sound of a public demanding a final, terrible accounting. But Donald Trump, the man whose voice had once commanded stadiums and dominated the global stage, was silent. He stood frozen behind the desk, the hot lights reflecting off his flushed, sweat-sheened face, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. For decades, he had weaponized language, turning words into walls, shields, and swords. Now, for the first time in his public life, he had none. The silence pinned him in place, and in the roaring vacuum, that silence was the loudest and most damning answer of all. Ivanka turned her face away from him, a final, public severing. Her body still trembled, but the tears that fell now were not tears of weakness, but of a painful, catastrophic liberation. She had detonated a bomb inside her own family, and while she would be caught in the blast, she had, in that one defiant act, freed herself from the role of shield maiden. "I won't do it anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The microphones caught it, and the audience heard it not just as a refusal, but as a confession to the world that there had been something to protect all along. Baron's hands shook as he tried to steady her, his eyes darting between his father's frozen hollow face and the ravenous cameras that seemed to swallow him whole. He was too young for this, too raw, too unprepared for the violent collapse of his entire world. The chants pounding in his ears weren't just demands for truth, they were demands for him, for a piece of his identity he could not give. He hunched inward again, a boy trying to make himself small enough to disappear from the rubble of a fallen kingdom. But the cameras did not allow it. Every flinch, every twitch, every glance of terror was magnified, consumed, and weaponized into a narrative of guilt by association. Melania leaned back in her chair, a figure of chilling composure amidst the ruins. Her arms remained crossed, her expression unreadable, but the faintest tilt of her head betrayed something, a cold, calculating satisfaction. For years she had endured silently, the rumors, the whispers about her marriage, her role, her place in the gilded fortress. Now, in front of millions, she watched it crack open and burn. Whether she was horrified or vindicated, no one could say. But the image of her detachment, of her quiet, almost regal withdrawal from the chaos, would fuel endless columns, talk shows, and op-eds for weeks to come. She was the survivor, already assessing the wreckage and calculating her next move. Jasmine stood tall, the unopened folder still resting in her hand. She didn't raise it now. She didn't need to. Its purpose had been served. It was the key that had unlocked the cage, and the animals inside had done the rest. "The truth," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the chants like a bell in a storm, "isn't something you can bury forever. Tonight, the world has seen what silence costs. It costs dignity, it costs trust, and in the end, it costs a family." Her words hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as an epitaph. The host, pale and shaking, shuffled his cards helplessly. His voice cracked as he finally tried to close the broadcast, a captain trying to read a final log entry as his ship went down. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to end here for tonight." But no one was listening. The show wasn't his anymore. The show wasn't even the network's anymore. The show belonged to history. Outside the studio, the crowds had swelled into a roiling, angry sea. Helicopters hovered above, their searchlights sweeping over the restless masses. News anchors shouted over each other, every outlet declaring a national turning point. On every screen, the clips were already looping: Ivanka's breakdown, Donald's silence, Baron's trembling face, Melania's cold gaze. The moment had metastasized. Back inside, Donald finally leaned forward, his voice a hoarse, cracking whisper. "This is a setup. It's lies. All lies." But the words lacked all force, all conviction. The roar of "answer, answer," drowned them instantly. His empire of words had collapsed. His arsenal of denial was exhausted. The cameras pulled back, capturing the final damning tableau in a wide shot. Donald, furious and broken, Ivanka defiant in her tears, Baron, a portrait of collateral damage, Melania, a cold queen surveying the ruins, and Jasmine, a silent, resolute victor. The audience understood what had happened. They had not received the truth in documents or testimony. They had received something far greater, far more devastating: the undeniable, unforgettable sight of a family unraveling under the crushing weight of its own lies. The lights dimmed. The host's voice cracked as he signed off. The chants still echoed, spilling into the streets, but the message was clear, carved into the night like scripture. The truth can be delayed, distorted, and silenced, but it cannot, in the end, be destroyed. Fade to black. Sound of the chanting crowd, which continues, relentless and furious over the black screen.